He arrived with nothing but the clothes on his back, the ghosts of his failures, and a key to a house that was more ruin than home. The town had already written him off, another lost soul destined to be broken by the old Blackwood place. They didn't know about the secrets he found hidden in the hearth, the whispers of the past written in the margins of forgotten books. They saw a bankrupt teacher playing with mud and stone, but they couldn't see the foundation he was truly rebuilding. This wasn't just about restoring a house, it was about resurrecting a life, and what he would uncover within these walls would change not only his future, but the heart of the entire town. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The bus wheezed to a stop, its brakes sighing like a tired old man finally sitting down. The door folded open with a pneumatic hiss, spilling Arthur Vance onto the gravel shoulder of a road that seemed to lead from nowhere to nowhere else. He carried 2 worn duffel bags, the sum of his worldly possessions, their weight a pathetic testament to a life dismantled. The bus pulled away, leaving him in a cloud of diesel fumes and a silence so profound it felt like an accusation. He stood for a long moment at the dusty, forgotten bus stop on the edge of Havenwood, a town he'd only ever seen on a map. It was late autumn, and the air, crisp and sharp, carried the scent of distant wood smoke and the damp, sweet decay of fallen leaves. His face, etched with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix, was a mask of quiet shame. He had been a history teacher, a man who once commanded classrooms with stories of fallen empires and resilient kingdoms, now a cautionary tale himself. Bankruptcy had been a swift and brutal predator, leaving him with nothing but a strange inheritance from a great-great-uncle he'd never known, a stone house on a hill. He looked toward the town, a small collection of rooftops nestled in the valley, then lifted his gaze to the brooding hill that loomed over it. Somewhere up there, shrouded in trees, was his property, his last resort. He adjusted the straps of the duffel bags, the canvas digging into his shoulders, and began the long walk. Each step on the cracked asphalt of the ascending road felt heavier than the last, a pilgrimage into his own failure. The crunch of gravel under his worn boots was the only sound, a lonely rhythm marking his ascent. The weight of his debt, a figure so large it had become abstract, felt like a physical presence, a phantom clinging to his back, whispering reminders of every poor decision, every misplaced hope. He had imagined the house, of course. The solicitor's letter had described it as a rustic stone dwelling in need of significant repair. Arthur had pictured a charming, neglected cottage, something he could fix up, a project to occupy his mind and hands. The reality, when he finally saw it, was a shock that stole the air from his lungs. It wasn't a house, it was a wound in the landscape. Perched on the hillside, it looked less like a structure and more like a creature slowly succumbing to the forest. The stone walls, once proud and strong, were split and buckled, with thick, woody vines clawing their way into every crevice, their tendrils like green fingers prying the stones apart. The windows were milky with grime and cataracts of dust, blind eyes staring out at nothing. The roof, a patchwork of slate and moss, sagged dangerously in the middle, forming a deep swayback that looked as if a single heavy snowfall would bring the whole thing crashing down. Overwhelming despair, cold and absolute, washed over him. This was not a fresh start, it was a tomb. He felt utterly and completely trapped, the last door in the world having opened onto a ruin. The antique iron key was a cold, jagged weight in his palm, its teeth biting into his skin as he approached the front entrance. The heavy oak door, weathered to a silvery gray, was set deep within the stone. He pushed the key into the lock. It resisted, a stubborn refusal to yield, before turning with a painful, grinding screech of metal on metal that echoed in the unnerving quiet of the hillside. He put his shoulder to the door and pushed. It groaned, the sound of ancient timber protesting the disturbance, and swung inward, revealing an abyss of shadow. Arthur hesitated on the threshold, then stepped inside. The door, unbalanced on its rusted hinges, swung shut behind him with a deep, resonant boom that vibrated through the floorboards and up his spine, plunging him into near darkness. He dropped his bags, the thud echoing unnaturally in the still, cavernous space. The air inside was a physical presence, thick and frigid, saturated with the smell of decades of mildew, trapped dust, and the faint, musky scent of animal nests. It was the smell of abandonment. A few weak slivers of light managed to pierce the grimy windows, illuminating a swirling ballet of dust motes in the gloom. Ghostly shapes of furniture, draped in yellowed, brittle sheets, dotted the vast main room like forgotten monuments. The silence was profound, a heavy blanket pressing in on him from all sides, broken only by the frantic beating of his own heart. A surge of claustrophobia, sharp and sudden, made him want to turn and fight the door back open, to flee back into the clean, open air. He was a ghost in a dead house, and the crushing loneliness of his situation settled over him like a shroud. He was utterly alone, in a place that had been alone for a very long time. With no power, the house was a labyrinth of shadows. Arthur pulled out his phone, its screen an almost offensively modern glare in the ancient dark, and switched on the flashlight. The narrow beam cut a nervous path through the gloom, revealing damp stains blooming like dark continents on the plaster walls and cobwebs thick as cotton candy draping from the ceiling beams. His light swept across the main living area and settled on the room's dominant feature. A massive, cold stone hearth, wide enough for a man to stand in, its maw black with the soot of 1,000 long-dead fires. And there, sitting on the thick stone mantelpiece as if they had been placed there for him only yesterday, were 2 thick, leather-bound ledger books. He approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. He ran a hand over the cracked, dry leather of the topmost book, a fine layer of dust coating his fingertips. He blew on the cover, and a gray cloud billowed into his flashlight beam. Carefully, reverently, he lifted the heavy volume and opened it. The pages were thick, yellowed, and smelled of time itself. He expected dry accounts, a simple record of costs and materials. But as his light traced the columns of numbers, he found something more, something entirely unexpected. In the margins, written in an elegant, spidery handwriting that flowed around the figures, were notes, observations, and fragments of a philosophy. Lime must be slaked for 3 months, no less. One entry read, "The patience of the water is a gift to the stone." Further on, another note, "The north wall weeps," check flashing above. Water is a patient enemy, but a foolish one. It always takes the easiest path. He turned a few more pages, his initial despair slowly being replaced by a flicker of intense curiosity. This was a dialogue with the past. "Frost is the enemy of green mortar," warned another annotation. "Do not work past October. The cold will break your heart and your wall." And then he saw a phrase, repeated in various forms throughout the book, a quiet mantra woven into the fabric of the accounts. "Patience is the truest mortar." He found the builder's name on the inside cover, written in the same elegant script, Elias Vance, a distant relative, his ancestor. For the first time since stepping off the bus, a fragile, tentative seed of purpose began to germinate in the barren soil of his despair. This wasn't just a record of expenses, it was a gospel of stone. The next day, driven by the gnawing need for basic human comforts, Arthur walked the 2 miles into Havenwood. He needed water, bread, candles, matches, the most essential supplies to begin his strange new life. As he walked down the town's main street, he was acutely aware of how out of place he looked, his city-worn clothes and the haunted look in his eyes marking him as an outsider. It was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the arrival of a stranger was an event. Conversations on the sidewalk paused as he passed. Faces peered from the windows of the bakery and the post office. He felt their collective gaze like a physical touch, a current of curiosity and judgment. He pushed open the door to the general store, a bell tinkling softly overhead. The store was a dim, cluttered space that smelled of sawdust, coffee, and old paper. A few locals were gathered near the counter, their low chatter ceasing the moment he stepped inside. They didn't stare openly, but he could feel their eyes on him from the corners of their vision. their bodies angled just slightly in his direction. He moved through the narrow aisles, grabbing a gallon of water, a loaf of bread, a box of long-burning candles, and a pack of matches. The whispers started before he even reached the counter, low and indistinct but carrying the unmistakable tone of gossip. "That's him," a man's voice murmured, just loud enough to be heard. "The one who took the old Blackwood place." "Poor fool," a woman whispered back, her voice laced with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. "The bank couldn't give that house away. The forest's already taken it back." Arthur kept his eyes fixed on the items in his hands, his neck and ears burning with humiliation. He reached the counter and placed his supplies down. The shopkeeper, a gruff, elderly man with a face like a weathered plank, looked him over with a flat, dismissive expression. His name tag read, Silas. "Find what you need?" Silas asked, his tone devoid of any welcome. "Yes, thank you. Just this," Arthur replied, his own voice sounding thin and foreign. He avoided eye contact, focusing on the worn wooden counter, scarred with a century of use. He paid in cash, the crumpled bills a stark reminder of his dwindling resources. Silas took the money without a word, his silence a judgment in itself. Arthur gathered his small bag of supplies and left as quickly as he could, the bell tinkling his retreat. The whispers confirmed his status. He was an outsider, a spectacle, a fool. The town's collective opinion was a new wall, one he hadn't anticipated, rising up around him. He walked back up the long hill, the bag of groceries feeling as heavy as his duffel bags had the day before. He returned to the cold, silent house feeling even more isolated. But now, a flicker of defiance sparked within him. The town saw a fool. Elias Vance's ledgers offered a different possibility. The house and the town were two sides of the same challenge, and as he stood before the crumbling stone walls, he felt a stubborn resolve begin to harden in his chest. He would not be broken by either. The nights were the strangest. In the city, night had been a time of artificial light and constant low-level noise, a world that never truly slept. Here, in the stone house, night was an absolute. It was a deep, velvety blackness that pressed against the grimy windows, and a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped turning. Arthur saved his phone's precious battery, so his evenings were spent in a small, cleared-out room, a former pantry perhaps, that seemed the least damaged and most defensible against the drafts. Here, in the flickering, dancing light of a few cheap candles and a single battery-powered lantern, he held his nightly communion with Elias Vance. The two leather-bound ledgers became his entire world. He spent hours meticulously studying the elegant, spidery script, his own pen scratching away in a fresh notebook, translating his ancestors' wisdom into a step-by-step plan he could understand. He was no longer just a reader, he was a student, a disciple. He learned that the local stone, a dense, blue-gray granite, was honest but unforgiving. He learned how the ground on the hillside would shift and heave with the changing seasons, a slow, powerful movement that could undo a year's work in a single spring thaw. He cross-referenced entries, finding a note about a weak foundation on the west wall in the 1880s and a corresponding entry 3 years later detailing the repair, complete with a diagram of the buttress Elias had built to support it. This was more than a history lesson, it was a living document. Arthur, the history teacher who had lost his way, felt a spark he hadn't felt in years. He had become buried in the bureaucracy of the school system, in the apathy of students who saw history as a collection of dusty, irrelevant facts. Now he was the student, and the subject was real, tangible, its lessons written in stone and time. He felt a growing, profound respect for this man, Elias Vance, who he knew only through his handwriting and his philosophy. Elias wasn't just a builder. He was a craftsman who saw his work as a partnership with nature, not a conquest of it. He built things that were meant to last, things that settled into the landscape and became part of it. Arthur, a man whose own life had crumbled like cheap plaster, found himself mesmerized by the idea of creating something so solid, so permanent. A kinship formed across the century that separated them, a silent understanding between two men named Vance, both trying to build something against the odds. After a week of study, The ledgers could teach him no more without action. The time had come to move from theory to practice. The first step, according to Elias, was the mortar. It was the lifeblood of the wall. Arthur took stock of his meager savings, a few $100s that had to last him indefinitely. He knew he couldn't face the Havenwood General Store again, couldn't bear the weight of Silas's dismissive stare or the imagined whispers of the locals. Instead, he drove his beat-up sedan, the last relic of his former life, to a builder's merchant in the next town over, a larger, more anonymous place where he was just another customer. Walking into the vast, echoing warehouse, he felt like a complete fraud. He was surrounded by men who looked like they'd been born with a hammer in their hand, their faces weathered, their hands calloused and capable. He clutched his list, transcribed from Elias's notes, feeling like a schoolboy on a foolish errand. He bought bags of sand and hydrated lime, a cheap wheelbarrow, a trowel, and a spirit level. The cashier barely glanced at him as he paid, but Arthur felt as though his incompetence was a neon sign flashing above his head. He was a teacher, a man of words and ideas, and here he was, pretending he could work with his hands. Back at the house, he chose a collapsed section of the garden wall as his practice ground. It was a low, simple structure, but even in its ruin, he could see the care with which it had been built. He set up his wheelbarrow, his heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and a strange, unfamiliar excitement. He consulted his notebook. 1 part lime, 3 parts sand, he read aloud, his voice sounding small in the open air. He measured the ingredients, his movements clumsy and uncertain. He added water, following the ledger's instructions to the letter. The result was a disaster. The mixture turned into a watery, useless soup, sloshing around the bottom of the wheelbarrow. He cursed under his breath, the familiar sting of failure rising in his throat. He added more sand, trying to thicken it, but he overcompensated. The soup became a crumbly, sandy mess that wouldn't hold its shape for a second. He tried again, and then a third time, hauling the heavy bags, his back beginning to ache with the unaccustomed labor. The gritty feel of the sand, the caustic, chemical smell of the lime, the frustrating, stubborn inconsistency of the mortar, it all conspired against him. He felt a wave of pure, unadulterated hopelessness. The simplicity of the instructions in the ledger seemed to mock the sheer difficulty of the execution. In a fit of rage, he kicked the wheelbarrow, a clang of metal echoing his frustration. The failed mortar slopped over the side, a gray puddle of his own inadequacy. He was standing there, covered in sweat and streaks of the useless mortar, staring at the mess he'd made, when a new sound broke the silence. Laughter. He looked up the hill and saw a group of local teenagers, 4 of them, wandering down the path from the woods. They were led by a tall, cocky young man with a swagger in his step, someone Arthur vaguely recognized from his brief, humiliating trip into town. They saw him, and their lazy meandering gained a new, predatory focus. They ambled over, their expressions a mixture of boredom and casual cruelty. "Hey, look!" the leader called out, a smirk spreading across his face. "It's the professor, building a sandcastle." His friends snickered, their laughter sharp and grating. Another one, shorter and wiry, pointed at the sagging roof of the house. "My dad says this place is gonna fall on your head. Says you're a damn fool for even trying." Arthur felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. These were the voices of his own deepest doubts, given form and sound. "You're wasting your time, man." The leader, who he now heard one of the others call Kyle, said with an air of finality, "Just let the forest have it. It wants it more than you do." Arthur's first instinct was to flee, to hide himself away in the dark, silent rooms of the house. But then he thought of Elias's patient script, of the solid, enduring walls that had stood for over a century. He set his jaw, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the handle of his shovel. He turned his back to them, a deliberate, calculated movement, and began to doggedly scrape the failed mortar out of the wheelbarrow, cleaning his tools with a furious, focused energy. Their words were just noise, an external manifestation of the failure he had been wrestling with his entire life. He would not let them win. Across the small valley, on the porch of a neat little house, an older woman, Eleanor, had stepped outside. She stood, arms crossed, watching the interaction on the opposite hill, a deep frown creasing her brow. A few days passed. The pile of failed mortar attempts grew, a monument to his frustration. Arthur worked from dawn until his muscles screamed in protest, and then he would retreat inside to the candlelight and the wisdom of the ledgers, searching for the key he was missing. He reread every note, every marginal comment, his desperation making him see the words with a new intensity. And then he found it, a small, almost overlooked annotation next to an entry about repairing a chimney stack. The science is in the ratio, Elias had written, but the art is in the feel. The mix must feel like damp brown sugar. It wasn't a measurement. It was a sensation. It was the craftsman's touch, the art that transcended the science. The next morning, Arthur approached the wheelbarrow not as a scientist, but as an artist. He mixed the sand and lime, but this time, as he added the water, he did it slowly, a little at a time, working the mixture with his shovel, then with his gloved hands. He ignored the ratios in his notebook and focused entirely on the texture. He felt for that specific consistency, the point where it was no longer a slurry, no longer a crumble, but something in between. And then, suddenly, it happened. The mortar came together, clinging to his trowel in a perfect, workable peak. It felt exactly as he imagined damp brown sugar would feel. His heart hammered in his chest. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the tremor in his hands. He selected a heavy, moss-covered fieldstone from the collapsed part of the wall, its weight solid and real in his grasp. With a reverence that surprised him, he scooped a dollop of the perfect mortar onto his trowel and spread it onto the foundation stone. The scrape of the steel against the stone was a beautiful, rhythmic sound. He carefully lifted the fieldstone and settled it into the mortar bed, wiggling it slightly until it felt secure. He picked up the spirit level, his hands still trembling, and placed it on top of the stone. The bubble, his tiny, merciless judge, floated for a moment before settling directly, perfectly, in the center. It was level. It was true. A choked sound, half laugh, half sob, escaped his lips. He had done it. He set another stone, then another, the movements becoming less clumsy, more confident. A rhythm began to build, a slow, meditative dance of lift, spread, set, and check. The scrape of the trowel, the satisfying thud of stone meeting stone, the quiet focus required to keep the line true. All of it worked to silence the relentless, noisy monologue of doubt and failure that had occupied his mind for months. He was no longer thinking, he was simply doing. The sun climbed high in the sky and began its slow descent, and still he worked, lost in the rhythm of the wall. By the time the evening light began to fade, casting long shadows across the yard, a small 3-foot section of the garden wall stood solid and true. It was only a few feet long, barely a yard high, but it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He stood back, his body screaming with exhaustion, his hands raw, but his spirit was filled with a powerful, unfamiliar sense of pride. He had built this. With his own 2 hands, he had brought order from chaos. It was real. It was solid. And for the first time in a very long time, so was he. The harshness of winter had been a silent, brutal teacher. It had tested the patches he'd made, finding the smallest cracks with icy fingers and driving wedges of frost into his imperfect mortar. But Arthur had learned from Elias's ledgers, which spoke of winter not as an enemy to be fought, but as a force to be respected and planned for. He had spent the coldest months working on the exterior, a relentless, punishing campaign against decades of decay. His primary battle was with the ivy. It was a monstrous, suffocating blanket that had held the house in a death grip, its thick, woody stems boring into the mortar joints like parasitic snakes. He worked with a pry bar and a hand saw, wrestling with the tenacious growth, tearing it away in great heavy sheets. Underneath, the stone was revealed, beautiful and scarred, a tapestry of grays, blues, and ochres, marked with the patina of time. It was like freeing a statue from a plaster mold. He patched the most critical holes in the walls, mixing small, precious batches of mortar in a bucket, working quickly before the cold could steal its strength. He learned to read the weather, to feel the subtle shifts in temperature that warned of a coming frost. His work was a frantic race against the descending night, his breath pluming in the frigid air. As winter finally began to loosen its grip, giving way to the tentative warmth of early spring, the results of his labor became apparent. He had used a rickety, terrifying ladder to clear the gutters, scooping out years of compacted, mulchy leaves and debris. Now, after the first proper spring rain, he stood in the yard and watched, mesmerized, as the gutters ran free. Water, the house's patient enemy, now spilled harmlessly from the downspouts, channeled away from the foundation instead of cascading down the walls in destructive sheets. For the first time, the house didn't look like it was dying. The oppressive, cloying smell of damp and mildew that had clung to it like a shroud began to recede, replaced by the clean, honest scent of wet stone and thawing earth. From the town below, the change was subtle but undeniable. The house's silhouette against the sky was sharper, cleaner. The sagging, defeated posture was gone, replaced by a quiet dignity. It had a presence again. Arthur, leaning on his shovel, his muscles aching with a deep, satisfying weariness, felt a sense of partnership with the structure. They were surviving together, two broken things learning to be whole again. One bright, chilly spring morning, as Arthur was carefully chipping away old, crumbling mortar from a window frame, he sensed movement on the path below. He stopped working, his body tensing with the familiar wariness of being observed. It was Eleanor, the older woman from the neat little house across the valley. She was walking slowly, carefully, up the steep, muddy track to his house. He watched her approach, his trowel held loosely in his hand, unsure what to expect. She was the one who had frowned at the teenagers, but she had never spoken to him. She reached his small, cleared work area and stopped, her breath coming in gentle puffs of white vapor. She didn't say much, simply held out a large, steaming silver thermos and a small, grease-spotted paper bag. "Figured you could use this," she said, her voice surprisingly firm and clear. Arthur stared at the offering, momentarily speechless. "Oh," he managed, feeling a strange heat rise in his face. "You don't have to do that." "Nonsense," she replied, pushing the thermos into his hands. Its warmth was a shock, a small human comfort that felt impossibly luxurious. A man who works that hard deserves hot coffee. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned his work on the walls, taking in the newly pointed sections, the cleared ivy, the general sense of order he was slowly imposing on the chaos. A look of quiet, considered approval settled on her face. "Elias Vance would be proud," she said softly. He always said patience was the key. The name, spoken aloud by someone else, landed with the force of a physical blow. It was as if she had reached into his mind and plucked out his most secret companion. The validation in that single sentence was so powerful, so complete, that it almost brought him to his knees. It meant his work was seen, understood. It meant Elias was not just a ghost in a book, but a remembered part of this place, this community. The coffee, when he poured it, was black and strong, and the bag held 2 thick slices of banana bread, still slightly warm. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. Eleanor didn't stay long, just nodded once, a gesture of shared understanding, and made her way back down the path. Arthur stood there for a long time, the warm mug in his hands, watching her go. The act of kindness was a small thing, but it felt momentous, a single crack of light in the thick wall of his isolation. A few days later, another vehicle rumbled up the hill. It was a dusty, dented pickup truck, and Arthur's heart sank as he recognized it. It was Silas, the gruff shopkeeper from the general store. Arthur immediately tensed, his mind racing. Was he here to complain about something? Had he somehow violated a local ordinance? He braced himself for a confrontation, his brief moment of hope from Eleanor's visit already starting to evaporate. Silas parked the truck, the engine cutting out with a shudder. He got out, a stout, formidable figure in a flannel shirt and worn denim. He didn't look at Arthur. He didn't say a word. He walked to the back of the truck, lowered the tailgate with a loud clang, and began to unstrap a heavy-duty aluminum extension ladder. Arthur watched, bewildered, as Silas manhandled the ladder off the truck bed, its metal frame gleaming in the morning sun. He carried it over to the side of the house and leaned it against the wall, right below the highest peak of the roof. Only then did he finally turn his gaze toward Arthur, though he still didn't quite make eye contact, his eyes fixed somewhere around Arthur's shoulder. "North gutter's still clogged at the top," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Saw it from the road. You'll break your neck on that rickety thing you're using." He gestured with his chin toward Arthur's own wooden ladder, which now looked like a child's toy in comparison. Arthur was stunned into silence. He could only stare at the magnificent, sturdy ladder now resting against his house. He stammered. "Thank you." Silas just grunted, a sound that was neither friendly nor unfriendly, but simply a punctuation mark. He turned, got back in his truck, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and a stunned history teacher in his wake. Arthur walked over to the ladder and ran his hand over the cool, smooth aluminum. It was an astonishingly practical, unsentimental act of kindness. It wasn't about welcome or friendship, it was about respect for the work. Silas, the gatekeeper of the town's approval, had seen the effort, had judged it worthy, and had provided the right tool for the job. In that moment, Arthur realized he had misunderstood Havenwood. The town wasn't cruel, it was simply cautious. It was a community that valued substance over style, work over words. They had been watching, waiting not to see him fail, but to see if he was serious. Silas's ladder was a sign, a clear and unambiguous signal. He was no longer just the fool on the hill. The ledgers had warned about the spring heave, the powerful movement of the thawing ground that could put immense pressure on a foundation. Elias had written detailed notes about checking the cellar walls for new cracks after the last frost. Following these centuries-old instructions, Arthur descended into the dark, musty cellar, a place he had largely avoided. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and stone. With his lantern held high, he began inspecting the massive foundation walls, tapping along the stones as Elias had described. He was listening for a change in sound, a sign of a void or a shift. Near the back, under the main hearth, his tapping produced a different sound. Not the solid, dull thud of stone and earth, but a hollow, resonant echo. His heart began to beat faster. He tapped again, confirming the spot. He took out his pry bar and carefully, painstakingly, worked the tip into the mortar joint around the hollow-sounding stone. The old lime mortar crumbled away. He wedged the bar in deeper and pulled. The stone resisted, then shifted with a low groan. He pulled harder, and it came loose, revealing a small, dark cavity hidden in the foundation, a secret space. Inside, nestled in the darkness, was a small, locked wooden box. It was dark, heavy wood, bound with iron straps, and it was surprisingly heavy. He carried it upstairs into the main room, his hands trembling with a mixture of reverence and excitement. He set it down on the floor, the afternoon light glinting off its rusty lock. He had no key, but with a set of small files and a piece of stiff wire, he carefully, patiently, picked the simple lock. It took nearly an hour, but finally, with a satisfying click, it sprang open. He lifted the lid, half expecting to find gold coins, or jewelry, or some other form of conventional treasure. But the contents were far more valuable. There was no gold. Instead, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, exquisitely hand-carved wooden bird, its form so lifelike he could almost imagine it taking flight. Beneath it lay a stack of letters, tied with a brittle, faded blue ribbon, and under the letters a single, cracked amber-type photograph. He picked up the photograph first. It was a portrait of a woman with a serious, intelligent face and dark, deep-set eyes. A small child, a boy of 2 or 3, sat on her lap, his expression equally solemn. The image was faded, the glass cracked, but the connection between the mother and child was palpable. He then untied the ribbon on the letters, his fingers clumsy. The handwriting was the same elegant script from the ledgers, but the words were not about stone or mortar. They were love letters, filled with a quiet, desperate passion, all addressed to a woman named Annalise. They spoke of her eyes, of her strength, of the son she had given him, and of his dream to build a house that would keep them safe forever. This discovery transformed everything. The project was no longer about restoring a building. It was about honoring a family's story. Elias, Annalise, their son, they weren't just names in a book. They were people who had lived and loved and dreamed within these walls. The house was not just a collection of stone and timber. It was a repository of a life, a legacy. In that dark, musty cellar, Arthur had found the house's heart. The discovery of the box shifted something deep within Arthur, a final settling of purpose. The house was no longer a project, a means to an end, or a shelter from his failures. It was a trust. He was not just rebuilding walls, he was safeguarding a story. This new resolve carried him through the burgeoning heat of summer. He worked with a different kind of energy, no longer fueled by desperation but by a sense of duty, of quiet reverence. He rose with the sun, his days measured by the rhythmic scrape of his trowel and the satisfying heft of stone. He was preparing to tackle the rotted window frames, a daunting task he had been putting off, when the familiar sound of a vehicle climbing the hill broke the morning silence. He looked up, expecting perhaps Eleanor with another thermos, but it was a small convoy. Silas's dusty pickup truck led the way, followed by two other cars Arthur vaguely recognized from town. He stood, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a gritty hand, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. A work party. The thought was so absurd, so foreign, that he almost laughed. The vehicles pulled into the cleared area beside the house, and people began to get out. There was Silas, looking as gruff as ever. Eleanor was there, her face beaming as she carried a large picnic basket. A handful of other faces he recognized from a distance, men and women, emerged carrying toolboxes, saws, and coolers. And then he saw him. Trailing behind a sturdy, broad-shouldered man was Kyle, the teenager who had led the mocking chorus months before. He looked profoundly awkward, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the ground. He was clearly not here by choice. The broad-shouldered man, who Arthur presumed was his father, walked directly toward him, a friendly, open expression on his face. "Heard you could use a hand with these window frames," the man said, extending a calloused hand. "Name's David, Kyle's father. I'm a carpenter. Got some spare lumber in the truck that should do the trick." Arthur shook his hand, his own feeling rough and clumsy in David's firm grip. He was speechless. Eleanor bustled over, setting the heavy picnic basket on a flat-topped boulder. "And we brought lunch," she announced to the yard at large. "You can't rebuild a house on bread and water alone, Arthur." The day dissolved into a symphony of productive noise. The sharp rasp of David's handsaw cutting through fresh pine, the rhythmic tapping of hammers, the low murmur of conversation, and the occasional burst of laughter. It was not a charity case, he realized with a sense of wonder. It was a community barn-raising, a shared project rooted in a deep, unspoken respect for the work itself. Silas, true to form, said almost nothing, but worked with a silent, formidable efficiency, organizing the removal of the old, rotted wood with the authority of a field general. David showed Arthur the proper way to build a window frame, his instructions clear and patient, his respect for the craft evident in every movement. Even Kyle was put to work, tasked with sanding the new frames, his initial sullenness slowly giving way to a grudging focus as he worked the wood smooth. At one point, during a lull, the teenager approached Arthur, still not quite meeting his eye. "Sorry about, before," he mumbled, his voice low. "This place is lookin' different." "Good. Arthur just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Thanks, Kyle. I appreciate the help." They ate lunch together, spread out on blankets in the dappled shade of a large oak tree. They were simple sandwiches, potato salad, and Eleanor's banana bread, but to Arthur it was a feast. He listened to the easy chatter, the town gossip, the talk of weather and crops. He was no longer on the outside looking in. He was here, in the center of it, a man covered in sawdust, sharing a meal with his neighbors. He had spent months building walls of stone, only to find that the most important walls, the ones that had kept him so utterly alone, were finally coming down. Late summer settled over the valley in a haze of gold and green. The days were long and hot, the air thick with the scent of cut grass and warm earth. Inside the house, a transformation had occurred. The main front room, once a cavern of damp and shadow, was now a testament to a season of shared labor. The stone walls were solid and clean, the fresh pointing a lighter gray against the dark, ancient stone. The floor was swept clean, and most importantly, new, properly framed windows had been installed. Arthur, working alongside David, had just finished setting the last one. It was a moment that felt both monumental and perfectly ordinary. They had caulked the edges, and now all that was left was to remove the thick plastic sheeting that had covered the empty window openings for months. "Well," David said, stepping back and wiping his hands on his jeans, "that's the last of 'em. Go on, you do the honors." Arthur's heart was pounding. He reached up and took a corner of the heavy plastic. With a gentle tug, he pulled it away. The plastic came down with a soft rustle, and for the first time in what was likely half a century, unfiltered afternoon sunlight streamed into the room. It was glorious. The light poured in, a river of liquid gold, illuminating the space in a way Arthur had never seen. It wasn't the weak, gray light that had filtered through the grime before, but a warm, vibrant light that brought the room to life. It caught the subtle, varied colors in the stonework, revealing flecks of quartz that glittered like trapped stars. It danced on the wide plank floorboards and painted a bright, hopeful square on the far wall. The air, no longer smelling of damp and decay, was now filled with the clean, wholesome sense of warm dust, curing lime mortar, and fresh-cut wood. Arthur stood in a pool of that brilliant light, his body tired but his spirit soaring. He ran a hand over the cool, solid stone of the wall beside the window. He could feel the history in it, the strength, the permanence. It was a moment of pure, quiet triumph, a profound sense of peace settling over him like the warm sunlight itself. He had not conquered the house, he had befriended it. He had listened to its needs, and now it was breathing again. A few weeks later, Eleanor visited again. Arthur saw her making her way up the path and went to the door to greet her, a genuine smile on his face. But this time she was not alone. Walking beside her was a man in a tidy blazer and slacks, who looked distinctly out of place amidst the rustic setting. Arthur's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of his old apprehension returning. "Arthur," Eleanor said warmly, "this is Mr. Albright, the principal of Havenwood School. He wanted to see the work you've been doing." "A pleasure to meet you, Arthur," Mr. Albright said, shaking his hand firmly. "Eleanor and several others in town have been singing your praises. It's quite the undertaking." Arthur invited them inside, feeling a flush of pride as they stepped into the sunlit main room. Mr. Albright looked around, his eyes wide with genuine impressment. He ran a hand along the repointed stone, his expression thoughtful. "Eleanor's been telling us about the work you've done," the principal began, his tone professional but kind. "And we, the school board, that is, took the liberty of looking into your record. You were a fine teacher, Arthur. Highly respected." Arthur felt a pang of the old shame. "I was," he said, his voice quiet, "a long time ago. Perhaps," Mr. Albright said, his eyes meeting Arthur's with a steady, compassionate gaze. "Our part-time history teacher, Mr. Gable, is retiring mid-year. Health reasons. The position is open. It's not much, just 2 classes a day, but it's a start. We think you'd be a good fit for our town, for our school." The offer hung in the air, as solid and real as the stone walls around him. A job, a way to reconnect with the profession he had loved, the profession he thought he had lost forever. It wasn't just a job, it was an anchor, a formal invitation to become part of the community that had already begun to embrace him. He thought of his arrival, a bankrupt man with nothing but 2 duffel bags and a heart full of failure. He thought of the mocking teenagers, the dismissive shopkeeper, and the crushing weight of his isolation. And then he thought of the hot coffee, the sturdy ladder, the shared laughter over sandwiches, and the warm sunlight filling this beautiful, resurrected room. His throat grew thick with emotion. "Yes," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes, I'd like that very much. Thank you." Eleanor beamed, her eyes shining. Mr. Albright smiled, a genuine, welcoming smile. In that moment, the last piece of the old, broken Arthur seemed to fall away, replaced by something new, something stronger, something that had been rebuilt, stone by patient stone. That evening, Arthur sat on the front porch steps, which he and David had repaired just the week before. The air was warm and smelled of pine from the nearby woods and the sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine from Eleanor's garden across the valley. Below him, the lights of Havenwood were beginning to flicker on, a small, scattered constellation of warmth and life in the growing dusk. He was no longer looking down on them as an outsider. He was part of that constellation now. In his hands, he held the small, smooth wooden bird that Elias Vance had carved for his son over a century ago. He turned it over and over, feeling its perfect, simple weight, its history, its love. He looked at his own hands. They were no longer the soft, unmarked hands of a teacher. They were the hands of a builder. The palms were calloused, the knuckles were scarred, and there was a permanent line of grime etched into the creases of his skin that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He had arrived in Havenwood broken, with nothing to his name but debt and shame. He had thought the house was his final punishment, a tomb for his failures. He looked from his hands to the solid stone walls, then out to the lights of the town. He finally understood. The ledgers had taught him how to build, how to mix mortar and set stone. But the house, the town, and the slow, rhythmic process of restoration had taught him how to live again. He understood the deep, quiet truth of the place, the secret that Elias Vance had woven into every stone. The house hadn't been waiting for a rich man with a crew of contractors to save it. It hadn't been waiting for a master builder to conquer it. It hadn't been waiting for money at all. It had been waiting for patience. It had been waiting for someone willing to listen to its whispers, to learn its rhythms. It had been waiting for someone willing to stay. He closed his hand around the small wooden bird, its smooth surface a comforting presence against his rough palm. A profound sense of peace settled deep in his bones. He was no longer the fool on the hill. He was the man who had rebuilt the stone house. He was home.